Hi, and welcome to this session on Cultures of Thinking and Action, Mindset 1. Schools must be cultures of thinking for teachers and students. My name's Francis Vigent. With me today is my colleague Judy Higgins and Lori Colpoys. We're going to be doing a virtual book group discussion on this topic using an anchor text called Cultures of Thinking and Action by Dr. Ron Ritchhart, published in 2023, and it's available on Amazon. We suggest that you would do some pre-reading, pages 3 through 25, which focus on this mindset one. And while you're doing it, capture your thinking in the form of 4 C's. First, connections with your experience. Second, the author's ideas that you might challenge. Third, concepts you think are worth considering. And 4, changes that the author is suggesting you might make. We've structured this as a discussion that you might continue with, 1, on your own, but 2, with your teaching team back home. This is part of a series covering each of the mindsets. So if you enjoy this conversation, we'd encourage you to take a look at the other mindsets in the series. One of the things that you'll hear us discussing is the difference between informational and transformational learning. One of the big focus points in this chapter, as Mindset 1, is setting up an understanding of traditional informational learning models in schools for both teachers and students, and the differences and the power of transformational learning. Some of the key points just to kind of keep in mind is that informational learning is focused on adding new practices, but not a real focus on fundamental change in beliefs or the system of schooling. They're often seen as an update to practices or a revision of teaching, rather than a revision of teaching. And oftentimes, the results of informational learning sessions are short-lived and have very minimal uptake in practices. And according to research by Knight, only about 10% makes it into the classroom. Transformational learning, which is one of our big focuses here at NOADM, is focused on substantive change in how we view our roles as educators, students' roles as learners, and the enterprise of education as a whole. Some key pieces of that transformational learning process is broadening our goals and purposes as educators, questioning our assumptions and perspectives, and aligning our mindsets with our goals. Again, according to Knight's research, there is significant uptake in practice, about 85% in transformational learning models, and that's consistent with what we've seen as an organization at NOADM, but also in our individual experiences. So with that said, we'd like to jump right in here and begin our discussion. The first thing we'd like to do in talking about this text is discuss this idea that for classrooms to be cultures of thinking for students, schools must be cultures of thinking for teachers. And this is right from page 1. And the question we'd like to put out there is, what could a culture of thinking look like? I don't know, Judy or Lori, if that this speaks to you at all in your experience or
This speaks
as a
to me.
teacher. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
this speaks to me so much because I don't think I realized as a teacher how much I wasn't really thinking about my practice. I was doing what I thought I needed to do. I was making sure that I was teaching the lessons that were presented. I would make sure that I was testing so I could find out whether or not my students were in my in my thinking, were they getting it? Were they, what I looked at was, were they learning? And it was quite a while before I really understood this and thought about, is this really how I should be teaching? Is this the best? And should I be looking around a little bit more and thinking about what is happening in my classroom? Is there a lot of thinking going on? Are my students feeling challenged, curious, and motivated? And it wasn't until I started to observe and talk to other teachers that I started thinking about this and thinking about, were there things in my practice that I could change?
Judy, what about, I guess, what about what made you question your practice?
Um, to be honest, I moved, I changed jobs. I was in a completely new environment where my students were struggling much more with, again, what I considered, it's always hard to talk about this, but thinking about my students, I don't know if they're learning. They're certainly not engaged. Things that I have been doing before in my other classroom weren't working. And I wasn't seeing any sense of curiosity about what was going on in the classroom. And I was feeling really helpless as a teacher because I kept thinking, what am I doing wrong? What are they doing wrong? I just know what's going on here. There's not learning going on here. And that really forced me to start looking at what's going on in my classroom that's different from the classroom I was in for 10 years. So I had to take really honest and difficult looks at the way that I taught before and appeared to be working. Students seemed to be learning. Students seemed to be curious. Students seemed to be following instructions. And why isn't any of that happening anymore? So that was when I knew I needed some help because I didn't know what to do.
Hmm. There's one point that I would challenge the author here is that when I when I hear this for classrooms to be cultures of thinking for students, schools must be cultures of thinking for teachers. It sounds immediately to me like it's all or nothing. And and I don't think it is all or nothing. I think that I think that in my experience, if your classroom is a culture of thinking and your school isn't, you leave. You find another
I also
school.
I also think learning can be contagious. You know,
Hmm.
if Judy, I don't know if you found sort of that safe space, that safe teacher to talk with, but I think learning can be contagious. And I thought the same thing, Francis, because that you did about, it feels almost hopeless if your school isn't a culture of thinking, but I think there can be baby steps to making it a culture of thinking, and I think it can start with you, you know. And I think learning can be contagious. So I wonder for you, Judy, did it become contagious?
Yeah, yes. And I love that word contagious because it became contagious for me when I felt like I didn't want to leave. I did want to stay there, but I felt like that was my first step was to reach out. It was another teacher who was brand new and I knew was as floundering as I was. And Francis, and Laurie, you agreed. I felt over and over that was my pushback with the book, where I kept feeling like so much of my movement was definitely baby steps. And sometimes, like you said, Laurie, it was between me and another teacher. And that definitely grew. But I felt that I grew tremendously in a school that wasn't necessarily a culture of thinking. We sort of had to go at that slowly and kind of build that on our own at the beginning.
That brings up a really interesting point. How is that possible? What and kind of coming back to this question here, what could a culture of thinking look like? What are kind of the bookends? Because I feel like at different points in my career, I guess I should say at any point in my career when I had students in front of me that I was grading, I would have said, I'm doing my job. But I think the job that I was doing changed dramatically, and what I thought of as effective instruction changed dramatically and for the better over the course of my career. Um, I feel like there are bookends to what a classroom can look like, and but this is asking very specifically what what could a culture of thinking look like? Um,
I think
I don't know for each of you.
safety, safety and
Safety.
like open safety environment, open dialogue, and being able to sort of question the status quo. I know as an early on in my teaching, I I questioned the status quo and kind of got shot down quickly and just shut my mouth and you know didn't go anywhere with it. Where I think as I got older and wiser, um, and changed jobs as well. I think it's that whole learners, can be leaders and kind of looking at it that way.
Mhm.
But if you don't feel safe in your environment, it's going to be hard to have a culture of thinking because it's going to require that hard dialogue
Mm,
where you're questioning things.
mm. Judy, was there
Well,
something you wanted to add on that?
yeah, I just wanted to, yes, safety is everything. And I think it can begin with finding one person that you feel safe with. So, as you said, Lori, you're not questioning it by yourself, driving home every day feeling so frustrated, to be able to have a conversation with somebody else and say, does this not seem like a great environment? Or, the beginnings of that.
I feel like you both are touching on the next quote that we wanted to discuss, which is this one here. When we develop cultures of thinking for teachers, we create fertile ground for professional growth and change. In such cultures, teachers feel safe to be vulnerable, to admit failings or mistakes, and to trust that their colleagues are giving feedback in order for them to improve. When I began my career, I taught in a very urban inner city um, school, sort of made for TV situation, and not in a positive, I wouldn't say it was the most positive. And when I when I hear this quote, I think about the politics of school, which I always felt kind of really hurt children because the politics of school and politics of professional growth uh, in that time and place felt to me like I couldn't take risks or I would be in the crosshairs in some way. And I saw that happen to colleagues where and even myself at some level where grants wouldn't be approved or different things like that. And a lot of energy goes into trying to, if you want to have a culture of thinking, I felt like a lot of energy would go into gaming the system for the kids, like waiting until somebody went on vacation to put my grant in so that it would get approved, or um, just basically playing it safe. But it was very, it stinks as a teacher when you have to play it safe for your career, and playing it safe isn't in the best interest of kids learning. And playing it safe is, to me, the opposite of taking risks. And feeling that in that kind of environment, I think, to me is the reddest of flags of how potentially toxic or dangerous it can be for teachers, feeling anyway, um, when it comes to risk taking. And just, if you want to ensure the status quo, that's what you want to do, is cause people to play it safe. So that that's a connection that I feel my experience here. I don't know if there's if that resonates, or if either of you had any connections to this.
I had a connection that was a lot safer than yours, Francis. And I think that what you address is challenging and real. The risk I took was much smaller, but was so meaningful in moving me forward. So as we were, testing out this new curriculum for No Adam, and we were being encouraged to have Socratic discussions with our students. Well, I could not even imagine that in my wildest dreams. I felt like I can't imagine controlling them enough for them to have a discussion. So there was a teacher in another school that I had met. She was she was also piloting the No Adam program. And we were talking about, and I think there were 3 of us in the group, and we were talking about, are you going to try this? How are you going to do it? So she said, I'm going to try it. I was dazzled, and I took a risk by asking her, could I come watch? And she was amazing. She immediately said yes. She took a huge risk, and she said, I can't promise that it's going to be great. It's probably going to be messy. And so we had planned a week from then. I approached my principal, asked if I could do this. She was very willing, which was great. That was another little bit of a risk. And I was very pleased that she was willing to let me go for that hour. I watched the discussion. There were things that were so messy about it, but there were also things that were so wonderful about it. And at the end of the discussion, after the students had, packed up, gone on their way, she immediately said to me, well, that was really mortifying. And I said, I thought that was amazing. And I so appreciate that I got to witness that, because while she was looking at all the failings of it and feeling like, oh, that was terrible, I was looking at all the things that I thought were wonderful and had really started thinking, I think I can do this. But what I felt that was so important to me was that she had taken a risk. She didn't love the outcome, but I didn't think any less of her. I thought she was amazing for taking the risk. And that inspired me to take a risk, which inspired me to start the best thing that ever happened to my classroom, which was actually having whole class discussions. And that put me and my students on this journey that I don't know that I ever would have gotten to without watching another teacher take a risk, which made me feel safe taking a risk.
And just to
I think
clarify,
it can.
oh, sorry, just one of the things I wanted to clarify was just that you had mentioned testing the curriculum for No Adam, but I think what you had meant was that piloting No Adam in your classroom for your school and in your district.
Yes.
And what I love about that is that you approach the piloting process as a risk-taking process, which I never had the opportunity to do. So anyhow, I'm sorry, Lori, I just wanted to clarify that.
I was just going to piggyback on what Judy said. And it's sort of those things I've seen that happen in places I've been in as well, where it can be really this grassroots effort that really can take hold. And like I said earlier, that learning sort of becomes contagious and really authentic. And when it's really driven from, that grassroots effort. And I've seen it happen in schools I've been in where it spreads,
Lori, I love so much. I keep thinking of that contagious, because that became so much fun, because then it became like, I couldn't wait to tell this other teacher, okay, I tried it.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was a mess, but this happened and that happened. And so we became, and again, she was in a different school, so we didn't have easy access to each other, but it was so meaningful and so exciting because then we could start to work with each other in terms of, well, this happened and I didn't know how to, how to fix that or where to go next with that. So we could start problem solving together.
And
Yeah.
I love that that problem solving together and the openness to mistakes, because that's something I think about. So my principal, when I taught elementary and kind of upper elementary, K to 6, um, I loved that my principal would come in and talk to kids and say, "Whoa, what's happening here? What did tell me about this?" And she would be so excited about what was happening. Not even, I don't think half the time she knew what was happening. But what was great about it is that the kids saw her as authentically interested in what they were doing, and I saw her as authentically interested in what was happening in my class and what I was doing. And when mistakes would happen or when things were not as good as they could be, it was always an opportunity. It wasn't, and the opportunity wasn't an opportunity for, tisk tisk. You've drawn outside the lines, but it was an opportunity for, look at all the great things that did happen. Look at the opportunity you have to continue that conversation tomorrow in what's happening next. Um, and I think for me, a big piece of that was, um, I was given agency, and I was giving my students agency, and I was given agency in order to create and in order to take risks. And so that made me feel safe taking those risks. And it was something I really appreciated about the culture there. And I think that what we're talking about brings up this, in a lot of ways, this next quote that we wanted to discuss, which is, within the paradigm of informational learning, leaders often assume that more is better, creating a full plate of offering to skill up teachers. Teachers may even respond positively to such efforts, speaking about a workshop as being useful, practical, giving them something they can use, focus on the nuts and bolts of teaching. But classroom implementation rate for such programs is only around 10%, according to the research. And just as a quick refresher, informational learning is that most commonplace, go to the PD session, hear somebody speak, they show you a tool, here's when you give it, here's what you look for kids to fill out, and here's how you grade it type um, session that I think we've all been a part of it probably many times in our career. Um, but yet, but only 10% from that kind of a session, even though they might be looked favorably upon, makes it into the classroom. So I don't know if either of you wanted to extend what you were thinking about to this or close out any thoughts. The question we have here is, how could I shift an informational focus on PD to be a transformational focus?
I just have to very quickly, and then I'm gonna let others talk about this. But Francis, I want to address what you just talked about with what you saw happen in your classroom with the principal walking in,
Mm-hmm.
because so much happened. Like, that administrator took the opportunity to maybe go through your classroom in a couple of minutes. And what happened in those couple of minutes is so much more than what could happen during a PD, where she made you feel, I'm sure, quite good and seen. Like, she sees what's going on here. Secondly, I think about that principal's opportunity, which I think they want to happen with PDs, but that principal's opportunity to say, you know, you should go take a look at what Francis is doing in his classroom. And to start to, again, going back to your word, Laurie, making that contagious. Something good is happening in Francis's classroom. I can't quite articulate it, but the students were so engaged and I was kind of dazzled. And how much more would that do for teachers to sort of seek that out and say, well, what is happening? Let's workshop that a little bit. Francis, can you articulate what's going on? Because I have the same students for another subject and they don't seem to be that engaged. And that feels like that principal would get a lot more than 10% of bringing that back to the classroom and trying to unpack why was there so much engagement and curiosity in there? And yet we just had this PD that we gave you lots of stuff to think about, and nobody's talking about that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it was effective for me for the reasons you're saying. And I think it created a need for information because I felt an opportunity to use it. And um, I felt that I wanted more success. And so I wanted to figure out how to make that success more well-rounded. And that, again, creating that opportunity for information. But to your point, that is the transformational focus, the informational focus of professional development, just getting a ton of information. It's so hard to understand, what am I going to do with this? Like, sure, okay, I have another worksheet. I have another something to give kids. I have a lot of things to give kids. What makes this better? And so it's no wonder to me that only 10% of anything that happens in an informational focus PD session makes its way into the classroom. There's actually probably, that's much larger than I would have expected, actually.
And it seems like a lot of the learning is out of context of something bigger. I know in my experience, we had very little time for PD and we had lots of PD. So we would fit in a lot of different types of PD in one year with very little time. So that whole less is more, I think, it is true. And I think, I think back to, I was on a professional development committee and perhaps that should have been my mantra, less is more, so that it can take root. It can, you're working it around a bigger vision and then you're putting it into practice, coming back and questioning, putting it into practice again, coming back and questioning, instead of these one-off sort of workshops that were very informational. Here's what you need to know. Okay, now go try it. And then you were done. You never revisited the topic again. So I think time is a big thing, and doing less.
Mm-hmm. Although I guess I would agree that less is more, but I would challenge what less means, because
I guess less coverage of 1,000 topics is what I'm referring to. It seems like that was sort of my experience.
Sure. In this chapter, one of the things that I connected with and that I really liked was the focus on sustained collaboration. And I feel like, in one sense, less is more. Throwing everything at teachers so that they have this infinite menu is not helpful. And I completely agree with you, in less is more. The flip side that I identify with, though, is that oftentimes the one professional development session at the beginning of the year or twice a year, in terms of the little amount of PD that happens, or time that's set aside for PD in schools, is the wrong kind of less. like I think about the less is more as being this collaborative conversation that's ongoing and trying to find ways to sustain that in a focused way. And what I loved about my um, teaching experience with Ms. Z, who's the principal that I described a moment ago, was that the culture in our school was that we were always talking about kids and what was happening with kids and what was happening in our classroom. And we were connecting with each other to try to figure out if somebody knew something we didn't, that we could use to try to inform how we're approaching something. And and so to me, it's what Dr. Ritchhart brought up in this book that 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 is also part of this less of more culture of thinking for teachers is not just the sustained collaboration, but getting to what he calls hard collegiality.
Mhm.
Because when I started my teaching career, in that first environment I described a few moments ago, um, I think about soft collegiality, which is, hey, how's it going? Looks great. Keep up the good work. Very surfacey, very based on kind of, transactional high and buy type thing. And not trying your best to build a basic relationship, but not upturn the apple cart or upset anybody or get too close in a sense. And in highly political environments, that makes sense, that people might conduct themselves that way. Later in my career, different environment, um, it wasn't political. It was this more culture of thinking that I think we've been talking about. And I think about that hard collegiality as being, um, saying to a colleague, like, that's, you know, that's something we can do, but um, I think if I do that, that's not really teaching science. I think that's teaching history, or that's teaching reading, or that's teaching something else, which is important, but that's not the focus of this time on learning. And so to be able to push back on a colleague, particularly an administrator, with that kind of hard collegiality, um, especially like a what if, if you're asking me to do this, um, I think that that's more history. What if we have that conversation in the context of this hands-on exploration that we're doing, trying to answer this question that we've come to consensus on as a group? Though that, to me, that's how our school thrived, was that this kind of pushback and also moving away from the debate of, this is why I need to do my idea, but more towards, can we accomplish both? And every time I hear, even now, in the context of there never being enough time, it's true. There's just not enough time in the school day, in the school year, to accomplish everything we'd love to accomplish. But if that's always the limiting factor, will we ever be better than we are now? And and I always think about this experience, with that hard collegiality as being sort of necessary to really move the needle, because there are so many potential barriers. I don't know if that um, I don't know if
Yeah,
that quite makes sense.
I think having to take a look at some really ingrained practices that may exist in teaching, that's a hard thing when I know when like level reading that became a thing in our school, it was hard for teachers to take a different mindset with that. Um, and it took a lot of reading and research and really thinking, a lot of conversations, a lot of collaboration. Um, and to take a look at some hard evidence. Um, but I think I think the relationship, you talked about relationships, Francis. I think the relationships come first, and you have to build those relationships so you can have those hard conversations, and then steer it more towards practice, not individuals, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I remember thinking about that a lot was, how do we change? How do we feel safe doing it? And I felt like this was one of the things that I felt really strongly about when I was piloting this new curriculum. And things looked very different. There was, in my classroom, to be able to give the students the experience that they deserved, things could look very chaotic. Kids weren't in their seats. There was a lot of talking going on. There was what could be perceived as chaos. I sometimes, you might not even be able to find me because I was sitting with a group. So I wasn't identifiable as anybody being in charge. And I decided I had to take it upon myself to help my principal, who might be walking into my classroom to do an observation. I didn't know when those were going to happen. And I thought, I need to get ahead of this and have a discussion with her about, here's what my classroom might look like to you. It might look like chaos. It might look like learning isn't happening. It might look unruly. And that was so transformative for both me and her, because I could say, like, take a look at this, go sit down and sit with a group and ask them questions. And that was so helpful to me because I was much less worried about, what's my classroom going to look like? Oh my gosh, I have to quiet the kids down. I have to look more in control. But helping her to see my classroom for what it really was and to listen to the students, and she did exactly that. She walked in, she sat down with the group. I didn't even know she was there because I was with another group. And her excitement around, I don't exactly know how this is happening, but these students that I was talking to were so engaging. They were so excited. They were teaching me things. And I think that, and Laura, you mentioned that too, to start, that's where I feel it can begin, is being vulnerable to each other and not feeling like I have to sneak around and do this. I have to only, maybe when my principal's gone, I can let it be unruly, but being proud of what was happening into my classroom and sharing that.
Mm. I love what you just shared because I feel like it's a great example of how, as a teacher, I can play a positive role in forming administration, even if it's my principal coming in on an observation, to focus on something different, um, and to focus on something, in a sense, bigger, more valuable, than perhaps some boxes that need to be checked.
Right.
And I guess to the heart of this question in this quote, it's like, why is it that administrators keep giving us all this informational learning PD sessions? And why, as teachers, do we keep asking for these things and and responding positively to the nuts and bolts explanation of the worksheet, the app, the, whatever it is, that little, that we're being given something to add to our practice. We keep asking for something to add to our practice, but that's not transformational. That's informational. Like, how do we break that cycle? where can we break that cycle? I mean, I guess is
Well, I think it's baby steps. And I think, we all talked about it at the beginning. One of the things that we felt we wanted to challenge is that we have to take on the whole school. We have to take this on, as an administrator, or as a teacher, and that just feels, well, I can't do that. It's, I'm having a difficult time just teaching right now. I can't transform the school. And I think when we can think about the baby steps that we can make, that that can go a long way towards helping us feel safe, helping others feel safe, educating maybe administration, other teachers, and just kind of creating this feeling that this can be so much more fun if we start to think about teaching and learning in different ways. And as you said, Francis, thinking about our students, because so much of PDs, it's focused on here's what we're going to give you to make your life easier.
The
Or
magic bullet that
yes,
doesn't really
yes,
exist.
it doesn't really exist, and
No.
often makes our lives harder. That it's like, oh, now I have to do this.
right. Well, and that's, and that's just it. It's that additive approach ultimately breaks down because at some point there is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that's the problem with ELA. That's the problem with math. It's, and some people might be offended by that, but despite that, there are real challenges. When you look at all the things that are added to the plate of teachers in, and it could be as simple as opening activities, summarizers, tickets to leave, so many grades in a class session, so on and so forth. Like there are all of these sort of artificial constraints that may be well-meaning, and there may be elements of them that are rooted in research. The application of them is not is rarely in line with the research, and then on top of it can actually have a detrimental effect when you consider just again the straw that broke the camel's back. There's some point where you can't add anything more unless you get more time, and so the time on learning has to grow. And where does that time come from? It comes from other things that we are part of our day as well. But I, thinking about that daunting task of, here I am, a teacher in a building. Um, when I started my career, one year, I believe I graded about 220 students. It was massive. I could not learn everybody's names. And it wasn't set up for success in that situation. But I think about myself in that situation. How could I have had more of an impact on the system as a whole? And I think just focusing on what I was doing was sort of a place to start. But I think about, where could I have turned to? So this this quote here, the presence of more inquiry-based talk in professional learning groups is linked to teachers' transformative learning, leading to substantive changes in teaching practice. Again, that 85% for transformative, 10% for informational. However, this type of talk is not the norm in schools. And I think about my experience, and the connection that I make is that I didn't even have a prep time. I was grading so many students, I didn't even have a prep time. And there was no opportunity for talk, except for like teachers getting together after school, and nobody wants to talk about school after school. So that was a really hard situation. But moving out of that and having the opportunity to talk with my colleagues more, the kind of talk actually really matters.
Mm.
And I think about that as sort of the tribal language that's there. And even overhearing the kind of talk in the teacher's room in my first position and then my later position was very different. So I how does this how did this hit the two of you when you saw this sort of connection to professional inquiry-based talk in professional learning groups?
I loved this because, and I told you both this story, but because I felt like in my school, there was often the kind of talk was often talking about all the reasons we couldn't do things, but not coming up with any solutions. And I actually had an experience that kind of forced me into tapping into others' expertise. I was getting my master's teacher certification. And one of the things that I had to do, which was my biggest fear, is I had to videotape an entire lesson. And so I just felt like I almost thought, even though it was going to mean a nice increase in my salary, I felt like I can't do that. That would just be so horrible. And I had to have somebody else do it because that, I needed to be followed around the room and make sure that it wasn't distracting me. So anyway, I asked a teacher who I trusted, who was in my classroom a lot. So I felt like she, knew a lot of the students. She understood what was going on. So I thought she'd be good. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take a big risk and invite her in. And so she videotaped me, and it was fine. It was, once I sort of got into it, I forgot about everything else. But one of the things there were two things that were so helpful, is that what I finally realized was that they weren't looking for me to videotape a perfect lesson. They were looking for me to be able to look at that lesson and critique it. What could I do better? That was the first time I ever was forced to take the time to do that. What could I have done better? Oh, how could I have handled that? Oh, I didn't even see that student trying to get my attention. So I was really excited by that. And then I decided I'd bring in, as long as my friend had been videotaping, I thought I'd bring her in and ask her, what did you think? She, of course, immediately said, I thought it was great. It was wonderful. You're always good. And I was like, no, this is not what I want. I want you to really help me critique it, because that's what I need to be doing. And that really loosened her up to really talk about, where could things have been done in a different way? Where could students have been engaged more? Were there things that I missed? And it was so helpful because this teacher had been teaching a lot longer than I had in that specific district. And to be able to tap into her expertise, but also for her to take a look at what we were talking about, it was sort of contagious, where she started thinking about, well, let me think about, yeah, I always do that too. Like, what could I do differently? So that was the scariness of seeking feedback led to just this incredible collaboration between the two of us that not only did it change me, it changed her as well. And we both started talking more openly, like, we should all be videotaping each other. Yes, it's scary, but yes, it's incredibly helpful.
Mm. Lori, I wanted to give you a chance
Sorry.
no, it's okay. Not a problem.
Yeah, the first thing I thought of when I looked at this was just, they talk about the deprivatizing teaching, and
Mm-hmm.
it's so true. You can be, you know, just by the nature of how schools run, you're in your own classroom. And it made me think of COVID, um, where we were just forced to work together. It was like a level playing field for everybody, including administrators, where it was just uncharted territory, right? And we were just forced to collaborate. And it brought us out of our classrooms. Strangely, in a time where everybody was, seemed you were not socializing, but COVID strangely made us socialize more as teachers. And it created a culture of thinking in my school during COVID. And it actually became a really positive experience for everybody because we were really leaning on each other.
If Lori, I was oh, go ahead, sorry.
Lori, did you find that you did a lot of being really vulnerable, being able to say to other teachers, like, how are you doing this? Like, how are you having a discussion? How are you, making sure students are engaging with each other, with the material?
Yeah, I would just say that the conversations were at an all-time high because we were all so in the weeds and it was new, and you were working with people across grades. You were seeing more people than ever, whether it was in Zoom, when we went hybrid. It created this camaraderie in our school. And, when you think schools are cultures of thinking, classrooms are cultures of thinking, that was really true. Because we collaborated so much, we had really great success. We heard it from the parents. We heard it from, our test scores were good, but I think it really was due to the amount of collaboration that we did in our school. We came out of our classrooms more so than ever, if that makes sense.
Lori, did it stick? Because that's I love that so much. One of those things that we learned from COVID. Were things able to continue once you were back?
I would say in pockets, yes, for sure. We were working across grades more than ever before. And we didn't just learn how to do the technical aspect of it, but we learned other things about it as well, within the different subject areas.
I love that because on page 7, and you don't have to turn there, but one of the things that's mentioned is this quote, centered on this kind of professional learning is centered on collaborative meaning making. It feels authentic rather than manufactured by outsiders and has been shown to have a positive effect on student achievement. And I think about COVID as being this huge shock that happened to everybody. To your point, everyone's thrown out of the classroom into this virtual environment that nobody's had to ever rely on. And schools had bought in wholesale to this idea of online learning and so on and so forth. But when push came to shove, it left people really wanting. And yet the culture in a community and the professionals in that community made all the difference, because what I'm hearing you describe in your experience is that shock was an opportunity for you all to come together and make meaning and to figure out how to solve the series of unique challenges, whether it's technical, whether it's getting the curriculum into a form that would work in this new format that you're forced into. And yet it was a positive experience for you as a professional, but had a positive effect on student achievement. And it's funny you bring that up, because I remember that your state standardized test data went up like 5 or 8 points or something on that magnitude, which the headlines that were running at that point was how there were these learning gaps that were coming out of COVID for many reasons. And yet here's a community that's got the data going the other direction. And
it was a hard look at practice, where that was a very different shift. I mean, PDs are always about practice, but it was about student engagement and looking at things we'd never done before, So
Mm.
taking a hard look at having to do things differently, I guess.
Mhm. But isn't that what it should always be about?
Exactly. Exactly.
And I
And it's
think
so
that,
funny, at the time it felt horrible, because it was overwhelming. But when I look back on it, it's a very positive experience for me. And I think
Mhm.
it's because of the way we all came together.
Mm. Yeah, how interesting. And that another quote from the book, also on page 7, when teachers explore and experiment with new ideas that may not always work, students observe how their teachers react and adapt. And so
Mhm.
what a wonderful a wonderful model, as
We were modeling mistakes a lot during
mistakes, but like
COVID.
intellectual apprenticeship. Here we
Right.
are thrown into this
Adapting.
situation,
Yeah.
and we're all going to adapt, us as teachers
Right.
and also us as kids. It's pretty cool.
Right. That made it easier to admit mistakes, though, I think, in a way, right? Because it was uncharted territory.
Right,
So,
right. So feeling the permission to make mistakes, because what
yes.
other option is there?
And you were
Yeah.
doing it in front of parents as well. On
Right,
top of
right,
it.
right, right. So brings up the next quote here. When a culture of thinking exists for teachers, morale improves and teachers report higher job satisfaction, which contributes to increased gains in student achievement. Unfortunately, this kind of meaningful, sustained collaboration among teachers is too rarely found in schools. Um, and I think, to kind of closing out the point of discussion we were just having, it's Lori, the experience I think you're sharing is not everybody's experience. And in fact, it's probably not the majority of people's experience during COVID that collaboration came together in that way with positive data results. For example, when compared to non-COVID, I mean that's that's amazing, right? Um, but but I think what the author's suggesting in this mindset is that a culture of thinking, when it exists at a school level, it's reflected at the school is a collection of teachers. So you have it at this sort of organizational level at the school. It's happening among professionals, teacher to teacher, and then it's reflected in the classroom. So in a sense, you're better prepared for these kind of shocks. You're better prepared in a way, to connect with each other and to do what's necessary to pull together. Um, I in other situations, imagine like where I started teaching, 20+% turnover each year, lots of new teachers, people without classrooms, floating, people on carts, all these kind of things happening. You feel like a mercenary. You don't really feel necessarily a part of the culture, because the people who are really there, that have been there a long time, they kind of keep to themselves. Again, they're good at playing the politics, and you're kind of learning how to do that too, to to establish yourself. That's how I felt. Um, I can't imagine if I had to teach during COVID in that environment that we would have been able, that I would have had the foundation to pull together the way it sounds like your team did, and react. I'm not sure I would have been able to even find my students or my colleagues. I just like, I just, and thankfully, I didn't have to deal with that. But what this question here in this quote, when a culture of thinking exists for teachers, morale improves, teachers report higher job satisfaction, so on and so forth. What's the danger if this doesn't happen? I don't know if it's something you've experienced, that the danger coming true, but if you think about even the absence of what you had in that foundation.
Yeah, I alluded to this earlier. My one of my very first year teaching, when I did question sort of status quo and got shot down quite, I asked a what if question or what if we did this instead kind of question. And it was all around being in the cafeteria and kids having to be quiet the last 5 minutes, and me just questioning, the purpose behind it. And what if we allowed them to to talk in the last 5 minutes, and was not met well. And the danger for me was I just shut down. I learned that that was not a place to question practice or to question status quo. And then you think about how that transforms throughout the school and what it means for the kids,
Well, and I think also you lose a lot of teachers. Like there'll be some teachers that just like, okay, this is how we do it here. So, okay, I'll do it too. But I know that, in a district I worked, there was just a tremendous amount of turnover because teachers didn't feel that they could, like you, Laurie, didn't feel that they could inquire about something that, well, I don't really understand why we do it that way. Can somebody explain? And even that wasn't accepted well. So I think that leads to a tremendous amount of turnover, which makes it harder and harder to create any sort of community where I could find someone to talk to that I trust, because every year I might have 3 new teachers that I'm working with in my building, in where I'm teaching. And I think that's so important, is to have teachers remain where they are because they're satisfied and they're curious and they're finding others. That's how you transform an entire building. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen with one person. It's continuing to let this learning be contagious. But that takes, I need to be there for a while to feel confident enough to do that and not feel, well, I don't fit here because I can't even ask one question.
Nobody wants their child in a classroom where the teacher's dissatisfied. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's the real danger.
Right. As we've been talking, this thought has kept coming into my head, and I want to make sure to ask the question is, the thought is the principal or the administrator who, like if I put on my principal or administrator hat, listening to this conversation, it dawns on me that if I don't get this right, then really nothing transformative is going to happen in my building in a big way. Like if I want, if I just throw information at people, if I create lots of these informational sessions, people are going to get something out of it, but it's going to be the 10% and not the 85%. And it's always going to be additive. And when there's something that needs to go away to add things that are new and different, that require broadening the way we think about teaching or learning, those are not going to be successful unless I create this kind of culture. And I can picture as a principal being frustrated that I talk about this. I put up the posters. I get a team together to create a mission statement for the school. All the principals are supposed to have their mission statements on classroom doors, but yet I don't really think I have a culture of thinking that's happening because I don't see morale improving. I don't see job satisfaction increasing, and I don't see the gains in student achievement. Like, what am I missing?
It can never be a top-down approach. Right, that he talks about leaders being learners, and that's where it has to begin. The leader
What does that
has to
look
be
like?
that has to be a leader who's willing to step into the classroom and listen and learn, like you were talking about, Francis, really knowing their staff, really knowing the students, and being a learner first, and then opening up to collaboration.
Yeah, and creating an environment, again, in which risk taking is embraced, encouraged, and understand.
And questions.
Yes,
Questions.
yeah.
So that when you ask a question, you're not shot down.
Right. So it's such a shift in thinking. And I it's so important for administration and teachers to get this, like to really understand, oh, this is what it feels like to take a risk, and it's scary but exciting. Or like, I think it's just to jump back, Laurie, for a second to what happened to your school during COVID. And these transformative things happened, and that you can even say, like, it was awful at the time, but it was amazing what went on. To have that time to question those things. Like, I would have loved to just, had all your teachers together and ask them a million questions. Who started this? How did this start? Like, we have to really dig into this because something amazing happened in your school. So let's talk about how. And I think that's what's so important for teachers, to have that time to think about something really great happened in my classroom. Well, I don't have time to think about it because I got to get ready for this tomorrow. But to really sit and speculate, we've got to have room for that, so we feel it. We feel what we want our students to feel. Let me think about why that did work or didn't work. Let's be curious.
And I think about the effects of COVID, even it's years later, where many incredibly talented and experienced teachers have retired, have moved on, and new generations have come to fill the shoes of those folks. And there's a lot of new administrators, some folks that were rapidly promoted with not a lot of experience even at times. And I think sometimes folks struggle with what am I doing wrong? And I think about the principal who's potentially looking at the situation as, well, I'm giving my teachers everything they're asking for. Isn't that the job? Why don't I have this culture of thinking? I am going in there, I'm listening, I'm giving them what they want. Is there something else out there that's a part of this equation? And I get this mental picture of being on a boat in a storm. And you absolutely need your crew on board. You need to be able to rely on them. But as the captain of the ship, the way the principal is, in a sense, sometimes you need to get on the bow and point, and you need to point at the things that are important when it gets really foggy. And I think that 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 there's and I think that that's the nuance of leadership sometimes in this, is it that creating a culture of thinking, like in my case, there was a culture of thinking in my school with Miss Z, but at the end of the day, if if what I was doing in my classroom was not aligned with the goals and the the goals of our community, the things that we aspired to, the things that we cared about, she'd be the first one to come to me and point out, like, hey, Francis, um, tell me about why you're choosing to do all these worksheets. Tell me about why you're keeping all your kids in lines quiet. Why are your kids walking the line at recess? She would ask me those hard questions, and I would expect that. And so she was holding me accountable to our vision as a group and helping to keep that ship on track, not necessarily micromanaging or top down. So there's this kind of balance that's part of skillful administration that I think is something that folks are struggling with right now as administrators and as teachers too. I don't know if that makes sense, or if that is anything that you saw during COVID as well. I think that potentially is a big factor. I think that being able to point to a particular a unified vision, for example. Oh, sorry, Lori. I don't know if you had something.
No, I agree with you.
Sure. Sorry, what were you going to say? Well, this last quote that we have, just as we finish up our time here, is effective professional learning communities depend upon them being cultures of thinking for the teachers involved. This means incorporating 8 elements into their design: adequate time for inquiry, facilitative structures that guide conversations, common language to talk about teaching and learning. And I guess to me, that's what I was talking about a moment ago, is this common language to talk about teaching and learning.
Mhm.
Diverse perspectives so we can break with our assumptions, a bias towards action, visibility through documentation, grounding in student work or classroom observations, and a desire to push and challenge ourselves and our beliefs. And that's, I think, another piece of what I was mentioning a moment ago. So if this is teachers learning in PLCs and it's mirrored in learning in a classroom, like what if, is it possible?
Well, how great would that be? I mean, I think of diverse perspectives, and I think of the work we do at No Adam and discourse and dialogue, and um, that one really speaks to me, diverse perspectives, so we can break with our assumptions. And I think that's so true in teaching. Um, being able to learn from one another and do collective learning together. Sometimes that takes somebody who has a perspective different than your own. Because I think so much of teaching, we can kind of stick with our old assumptions. And I think it's great when somebody can challenge that.
Yeah. I also think that a bias toward action is so important, because I think that's a lot of what happens with PDs, is that there's no follow-up. Are we going to try this? Are we going to talk about what it was like? And I think it's so important to hold everybody accountable. Let's all try this, not, not in a month, not once we get through the testing, but we're all going to agree to try this, and then we can come back and we can listen to different perspectives, and we can talk about what worked, what didn't work, and now let's go try it again. So I think that that's so important. And to your point, Francis, we need leadership that is going to make the time to follow up and make that assumption. This is not going to happen overnight, where change can be constant and slow, but it's so wonderful when you can look back. And I think it was so great, Lori, your point of you looking back on what happened in COVID. You couldn't look anywhere when you were in the middle of it, but being able to look back and reflect, wow, that was really amazing what went on. So I think that these are such important steps, but we do need leadership that's going to give us time, that's going to guide conversation, so it doesn't become all the reasons why we can't change.
Agreed.
I love that these 8 points really align to what we're encouraging teachers to do with children in the classroom. I think the first one's a little bit unfortunate in terms of adequate time for inquiry, because I feel like it's easy to latch on to the concept that there's not enough time in the school day to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. So doing something transformative or doing something in a different way is going to require more time. But what I
It's kind of
love,
like making time for it.
it's like respecting.
Yeah, right.
It's respecting. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I know what you mean, but I
Getting
don't.
rid of getting rid of time that's using the time wisely.
Exactly. It's looking. I guess what I picture is if I was to rank all the things that I spend time on in my day at school, where that time on learning gets spent on, if I was to rank those things by how powerful they are for student learning, where would I draw the line, the cutoff, and what would be below that line that I could get rid of? And what could I take that time and spend it on? Because I think if we thought about it that way, kind of dropping the bottom and replacing
Right.
it with things that are more powerful, we would be left with all very powerful practices, but also very impactful learning. And and where that comes from, I think about in the case of no Adam, but here obviously we're talking about PLCs, is what are the frameworks that students understand? Like in our case, we talk about scientific process and engineering design process, the dynamics of picture thinking routine, and this idea of playing basketball with concepts and engaging in Socratic dialogue. But all of that's aimed at creating diverse perspectives, helping students break with assumptions and incorporate new ideas and and create opportunities for action in the classroom. So these things we're talking about, like, and creating visibility through documents, like hands-on, where students are, they're developing lab plans, they are engaging in concept mapping, they are collecting data and forming evidence-based conclusions. It's like every part of these 8 steps or 8 parts elements are reflected in the classroom, but
And it's really authentic, Francis, because it's
it
their
is.
ideas. So what again, to your point, what we're trying to mirror in the classroom should be what should be being mirrored with professional learning communities, because we're letting them authentically work with their own ideas. And
And when you
perhaps,
go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
And, well, what I was going to say is when you look at a list like this and you look at things like the next generation science standards, and you look at No Atom as being designed for that, it's these are great things for teaching and learning. But what makes them so hard in terms of, you look at these next generation science standards, why are people deferring to, red light, green light? Um, why are they looking for sometimes things that are quick and easy and additive to try to be in compliance, without making transformational shifts? Uh, I think it's because these pieces are not in place at an organizational level. They're not the, these things are not happening in professional learning communities. These things are The culture of thinking is not in place at a school level. So when you look at the classroom level, it doesn't mirror it. And it's hard to mirror it because it's an informational focus, looking for something additive to the classroom in order to meet those needs. And in some ways, it makes me a little sad, but it also makes me hopeful because these things do happen. They are happening in communities. And I feel like the shift in next generation science standards in particular has caused a shift in testing, has caused a shift in focus where if 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 people don't start thinking about these kinds of things in PLCs and as cultures of thinking at a school level, they're going to kind of run out of the silver bullets that they try, and eventually they're going to have to really dig deeper. And that gives me hope because there's now a path to digging deeper, um, where I think with the fact-based standards that used to be in existence, it was kind of a coin toss if that ever might happen. But just sort of I guess maybe uh, considering this idea in a broader context, what's being suggested by the author here. Um, I, any connections that either of you would like to make to this before we close out our discussion here?
I just want to give a quick shout out
Sure.
to number 8, a desire to push and challenge ourselves and our beliefs. That's what we want for every student. And when you sort of, I feel like that fire was lit again under me when I really got this. I thought about teaching very differently when it was fun to think about challenging myself and challenging myself to take more risks and to learn more and to consider different perspectives. And I think that I recognize how much that was and is what I want for students that I teach.
And I think of the connection between challenge and engagement for adult teachers and for students. Um, I think challenge is what drives engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you both. So thank you for all your time. I think this is a good spot to close out our discussion, if that's okay with you both.
Mm-hmm.
And for the folks that have joined us, again, would encourage you to check out Cultures of Thinking and Action Mindset 1 if you haven't read it. Despite having listened to this conversation, I would encourage you to go back and read it. There's much, much more than we've had time to dig into here today. And again, I'm Francis, my colleagues Lori and Judy, and you can follow us on Twitter at NoAdam. Check us out on facebook.com/NoAdam, or for more thinking related resources, or to check out NGSS design curriculum for your state that is intended to help support you in creating a culture of thinking in your classroom around science. Go to noadam.com.